Hello and thanks for joining us for the latest news update here on France 24. Our top story: the killing of over 60 Palestinians in a Gaza neighbourhood overnight is being described as a war crime by the Arab League. Despite a humanitarian truce, medics say in total 100 Palestinians have died this Sunday. After fierce shelling, footage showed bodies strewn in the streets of Shijaya district. The Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas said it was a massacre. The UN Chief Ban Ki-moon urged Israel to do far more to spare civilians. Tom Waterhouse has this report, which contains graphic images.
The ceasefire lasted barely half an hour. But during that time, some 15 ambulances managed to get into the stricken district of Shajaya to evacuate the injured. There they found scenes of devastation, streets strewn with bodies. Many locals here have already fled. Some used the brief respite in the fighting to rush their loved ones to hospitals. Among the dead, a paramedic who had come to help those in need.
He wasn't fighting, he was saving lives. Did he deserve to die?
Israel's army has accused Hamas of breaking the planned 2-hour humanitarian ceasefire by continuing its rocket fire. Israel believes this neighborhood is a Hamas stronghold, rich in weapons, rockets and the so-called terror tunnels. But the bombing of Shajaya has already killed scores of civilians and injured over 200 more. It's the bloodiest day in Gaza since the start of the Israeli offensive.
We didn't want to see civilians caught up in this fighting, and that's why, over a period of days, we repeatedly called upon the civilian population to evacuate the area. Hamas told the civilians to stay because Hamas wants to exploit them as a human shield.
Hamas, however, accuses Israel of committing war crimes on the streets of Shajaya and of blocking emergency services.
The Red Cross called Hamas this morning and offered an agreement of a pause for a few hours to allow the evacuation of those who've been injured and those who have been martyred. We agreed to this, but the Israeli army refused to allow ambulances to transport the injured and dead.
Palestinian leaders have called Sunday's events here a massacre. President Mahmoud Abbas has announced 3 days of mourning.
The Israeli offensive using tanks and warplanes to target the Shijaya district marks a new escalation in Israel's ground offensive. It's added again to the number of refugees. The UN says over 70,000 people are now being sheltered in 50 schools it has set up. Let's speak now to Nadia Dibsi, a spokesperson with the Red Cross. She's in Jerusalem. Nadia Dibsi, thank you for your time. A Red Cross humanitarian ceasefire was negotiated this Sunday after this escalation in the violence. In the end, it wasn't respected. Israel blames Hamas for that. Can you give us your assessment of the situation in Gaza overnight?
Well, I think that today, from a humanitarian perspective, we've obviously witnessed an intensification in the fighting that was this morning, in the early hours of the morning in the northeast of the Gaza Strip in the Shujaiya neighborhood, with a death toll that is rising. This, of course, is a concern for us as a humanitarian organization, a deep concern. One, as you said, because of the civilians that should, under international law, be respected and protected. And secondly, because we were unable to access the area fully and safely. Many ambulances tried to reach the area in the early hours of the morning. As some ambulances came under fire. It was very difficult to access this area, and therefore we felt that we should act in our role of a neutral intermediary and try and reach this agreement with the parties to the conflict in an effort to offer essential humanitarian assistance that was was not fully implemented on the ground, but it remains an essential priority for us. People are in need of urgent assistance in this neighborhood, and it's part of our job to do it, and it's the responsibility of the parties to facilitate it.
Now, Israel says they dropped flyers over the Shijaya neighbourhood several days ago. But what options do Gazans have if they want to escape the threat of violence or of the fighting?
I think that the difficulty is illustrated by the situation in the last 13 days of hostilities in the Gaza Strip. The civilian population is under pressure. They're afraid. Sometimes they're leaving their homes, trying to find safer places, not always knowing where to go. There are also people who are staying behind. So this is also a concern for us as the Red Cross, and something we've passed on to the parties to this conflict. Civilians need to feel safe. They need to be protected. They need to be spared from the consequences of these hostilities. And unfortunately, the situation on the ground from a humanitarian perspective is becoming quite difficult, as we witnessed this morning in Shujaiya. So therefore, it's even more necessary for the parties today, now more than ever, to really put in practice the basic principles that international humanitarian law has presented, which is respecting these civilians, respecting ambulances and the work that they're trying to do, and allowing us to do our work on the ground. And that's very, very much needed.
Is this current situation any different from previous Israeli offensives into Gaza? There is an impression now that, other than UN shelters, residents in Gaza don't know where they'll be safe.
I think it's difficult to compare different situations and different periods of time, but I think today was definitely an intensified hostilities in an area where there are civilians, in an area where people need urgent assistance and they need to have access to it. And for us, it was a challenge to reach this area. So I think that, as you said, we are confronted with a situation where civilians are extremely concerned, are afraid for their lives, and they don't know where to go. And we're monitoring the situation of people who are leaving their homes, where they're going, where they're staying, but also those who are left behind, who can't leave or are not able to leave. This is a major humanitarian concern for us, and we're looking at it very closely.
And negotiations with Israel over the creation of humanitarian corridors, is there any sign of success in putting these in place?
The role of coordination is something that we do with both parties as a neutral organization. There are two parties to this conflict. Both parties bear responsibilities under international law, and therefore they both bear the responsibility of giving us the space and facilitating the access of ambulances, protecting civilians, allowing essential infrastructure to be repaired. We've seen a lot of damage happening to water infrastructures in Gaza. People are not only, their lives are at risk, but also essential vital services such as water, such as electricity. And we're also hearing that health services are finding it very difficult to cope with the mounting number of casualties.
Nadia Dibsi with the Red Cross in Jerusalem. Thank you very much for your time. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu continues to vow that Israel will take whatever action is necessary to halt Hamas rockets. Speaking on Sunday, he said troops were dismantling the militants' tunnels quickly, but the aim was to demilitarize the Gaza Strip. The Israeli military has confirmed its highest losses. 13 soldiers were killed in combat with Hamas militants overnight. Our correspondent James Andre has more from Tel Aviv.
Today, 5 Israeli soldiers were buried here across Israel, and of course that has a massive impact on the Israeli public opinion, because indeed this ground operation was delayed as long as possible. Benjamin Netanyahu didn't take that decision for 10 days, and the idea was to avoid to actually have a ground operation when he knew that potentially there will be casualties and people wounded. And this is what's happening on quite a wide scale, since another 13 soldiers have been declared killed over the past few hours, and that is a heavy death toll for Israelis. Got to remember that in the Israeli army you have a lot of young Israelis who are doing their national service, their military service. They have to do 3 years for the men, 2 years for the women, and a lot of the soldiers who are actually operating in Gaza right now are these young people doing their national service. So a lot of families here are indeed concerned, and to see these soldiers die is very emotional for the Israeli public.
James Andre reporting there. And just to bring you up to date news coming in on the news wires, Hamas has claimed, the armed wing of Hamas has claimed that they have captured an Israeli soldier during fighting in Gaza. More on that as we get it. Now, moving on to our other main news, the MH17 plane disaster in eastern Ukraine. The Prime Minister of the Netherlands, Mark Rutte, says he's agreed with world leaders that his country will coordinate efforts to identify the remains of the victims of the Malaysia Airlines jet massacre. Over half of the 298 passengers were Dutch. Pro-Russian separatists, widely blamed for the atrocity, now reported to have stored 192 bodies recovered from the debris field onto a refrigerated train.
Refrigerated carriages. Pro-Russian separatists say this train is specially equipped to transport the bodies of those who died here in eastern Ukraine. The Malaysia Airlines crash took place some 15 kilometres away on Thursday night. OSCE observers are on site. Separatist rebels haven't allowed them to board the train, but they can take photos. Body bags and human remains, a difficult scene to document.
The problem, at least that we observe, is that train station is very small and very old, and I don't think the facilities are there in place for extensive identification work to happen. So presumably it would be better to move it somewhere to a safer area where that all can happen.
Since the plane went down, Ukrainian authorities have been pushing for control of the situation, demanding access to the site. Yet separatists are guarding the area surrounding the crash. They say they've sent key items to Donetsk and are now awaiting the arrival of specialists.
We have discovered some technical parts from the plane which are assumed to be the so-called black boxes. I stress that we do not have specialists in aviation security in the People's Republic of Donetsk, but we still presume that these are the objects in question, that is, the black box.
The delay in dealing with the site and the victims has been criticised by international authorities, with US Secretary of State John Kerry wading in on the cause of the crash. He said it was clear that the missile that struck the plane came from Moscow.
And so the US Secretary of State John Kerry blaming Ukraine's separatists for the downing of the aircraft. He says there is extraordinary circumstantial evidence to show Russia was almost certainly complicit in arming the rebels. Take a listen.
Russia supports the separatists, supplies the separatists, encourages the separatists, trains the separatists, and Russia needs to step up and make a difference here. We picked up the imagery of this launch. We know the trajectory. We know where it came from. We know the timing, and it was exactly at the time that this aircraft disappeared from the radar. We also know from voice identification that the separatists were bragging about shooting it down afterwards. So there's a stacking up of evidence here which Russia needs to help account for.
And here in France, protesters have again defied a ban on demonstrations against Israel's Gaza offensive, and it's turned violent. Youths set fire to cars and rubbish bins in a Paris suburb after an initially calm show of support for the Palestinian cause. Sunday's unrest in the north of Paris is the second time in 2 days that pro-Palestinian protests have descended into ugly scenes.
Organisers tried to get demonstrators to disperse in peace, but within minutes the pro-Palestinian protest in Sarcelles, a suburb north of Paris, descended into violence. A few hundred metres from the epicentre, riot police and volunteers from the Jewish community stood guard at the local synagogue.
We've never seen anything like this. We've always respected each other.
The scenes were similar to those in Paris on Saturday when a banned pro-Palestinian demonstration turned into a riot. The French Prime Minister condemned the incident on Sunday morning as he attended a ceremony commemorating the deportation of Jewish Parisians during the Holocaust.
France will not let agitators whip up any kind of conflict between communities. That is not France.
Sarcelles is nicknamed Little Jerusalem. It's home to more Jewish businesses than any other Parisian suburb. Before the protest on Sunday, some shopkeepers closed their shutters in anticipation of trouble.
I'm closing up because I'm scared.
They have the right to protest for the Palestinians. We're not against that. But the problem is we're afraid it will get out of control.
Another protest is planned for Wednesday evening in Paris. Authorities haven't yet decided whether or not to ban it.